The Inside Scoop, this is Mark Levine. If you want to call in, it's 202-889-9797, 202-889-9797. I am on WeAct Radio every Sunday from noon to 3. The first hour is the Raucous Caucus with Garland Nixon and Terry DeKester. You heard some of Terry earlier today. And then comes the Inside Scoop, where I try to give you the inside scoop on everything going on in the world, whether of legal or political or whatever basis. The reason I'm talking about foreign policy largely is because it's, we have transitions. We have transitions in the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. But I also think we need to have a smarter look at foreign policy and specifically at the Arab Spring. I don't think Barack Obama really knows, or most people really know, how to get a handle on what's going on in the Arab world, to understand not only what the motivations are, but how to make a successful transition to democracy. It's always been difficult to make a transition from a dictatorship to a democracy. Just ask the French during the French Revolution, or the Russians during the Russian Revolution. Right? The French Revolution famously had a reign of kings who were brutal. People died in the streets in poverty in France. The famous quote that's almost certainly apocryphal, it didn't happen, but it's said to have occurred when Marie Antoinette is surrounded by all these fancy cakes. She's the Queen of France, and they say that the people are starving, and she supposedly said, well, why don't they just eat cake? I got plenty of cake here. Of course, the peasants didn't have bread. Now, even though she probably didn't say that, this idea that the French kings and queens did not give a damn about the suffering of the ordinary French people is certainly true. And then what happens? The French have a revolt. At first it begins to be democratic. They come out and they have the slogans, liberty, equality, fraternity, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And they take over the government, they free the Bastille, and within 4 years, the French people themselves are killing each other. They've killed not only the king, but the aristocrats, blood's running in the streets. Mr. Guillotine comes up with a new invention that leads to a bunch of heads separated from their bodies, and this is often called the Reign of Terror. So revolutions don't always succeed. That's not a Western thing. That's a human thing. Because people are so angry at the people in power, they often go too far, and they go too far in the other direction. In the Russian Revolution, again, the Democrats actually do take over from the Tsar, who was a very bad leader, and for about 8 or 9 months there really is freedom in Russia in 1917, and then the communists take over and they do their coup d'etat, and well, the history of the Soviet Union, that's the next 80 years or so. So how do we have revolutions that succeed? Why did the American Revolution succeed where the French Revolution and Russian Revolution failed? And I think the answer is the American Revolution went relatively slowly. Not that much changed. Sure, we got rid of the British, but we still had, white men owning property still in charge. We didn't get rid of slavery. That didn't happen until the Civil War. But we also didn't overturn the society. We didn't have previously. We didn't kill the British king. We didn't have massive massacres in the streets. I bring in this history to compare it to today's Arab Spring. And I think we've seen, just like, after the fall of communism, right? We saw in Romania, in Ukraine, in Belarusia, we had some very strong takeovers where people killed the prior dictator and massive attacks in the streets. And those countries are not as liberal as countries like the Czech Republic or Poland, countries where the reaction was less severe. And it's not that the dictators don't deserve all the misery they can get, but I think there are, if you will, slow revolutions and fast revolutions, and the best ones are the slow ones. And I saw Fareed Zakaria this morning talk about why Jordan and Morocco are the more successful Arab revolutions. I would argue Tunisia belongs in that group. In Jordan and Morocco, you have kings, but they're allowing a constitutional monarchy. I mean, England, after all, transformed from a dictatorship, a monarchy, the king rules, to one of the great democracies of the world, and did so with almost no bloodshed, and did so over time as Parliament got more and more and more rights over centuries to become the country it is today. There was no reign of terror in Great Britain. And that's what's happening in Morocco. That's what's happening in Jordan. Tunisia, they got rid of the dictator, but there was a civil society, there was a educated middle-class people, and they've taken over, and I have high hopes for Tunisia as well. I have less high hopes, well, for a country like Iran. Iran is a lot more like the French Revolution, right? They got rid of a horrible dictator, the Shah, no question about it, but they replaced him with yet another dictator, someone else who mistreats the people so much that they had their own revolution called the Green Revolution a couple years ago, and is supporting terrorist activity all over the globe. In Libya, we had a much more violent revolution than in Tunisia, and the America, I think, helped make it more rational than it otherwise would have been, and I think that's why Libya is still a mess, but more likely to be on the road to success. And you have a country like Egypt. Egypt, they overthrew their dictator, but they went and they did elections first and civil society later. And I think there's some who think, well, elections, that's how you tell if it's a democracy. Just have elections. A democracy is much bigger than an election. Sure, elections are necessary for a democracy, but they're not sufficient. To have a true democracy, stable democracy, one that lasts over time, one that's respected by the people, you also need things like minority rights, individual rights, rights to practice your own religion, rights for women, make sure that women have equal rights to men, rights for minorities, rights to challenge your government, to disagree with your government, free speech rights, rights to put out a newspaper and say, I disagree with the leader of the government. We in America do that without even thinking. And yet that is dramatic freedom. So an election is not enough. And I certainly was no fan of the Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak, and I had some hopes for the new person coming in, Mohamed Morsi. But I recognize that if you come from an illiberal tradition, such as Islamic fundamentalism, and you take over, you can be no better than the people that came before. That's what we saw happen in Iran. So what can the United States do to cause a more liberal democracy where individual rights and freedoms are respected, such as is occurring slowly in Morocco and Jordan, I think is successfully occurring in Tunisia? And how do you prevent the kind of Iranian, or I fear Egypt as well, solution where you go from one dictator, one pro-American dictator, and get to an anti-American Islamic fundamentalist dictator, and the people are no better off? I think the answer is that you support those elements that support democracy. It's really that simple. I'm not saying go fix elections, to be sure, but I am saying that if you look at what we did in Libya, you can see that the reason why the Libyan people, actually most of them love America, is because we saved them from genocide. We saved them from, well, if not genocide, mass murder. We helped them get rid of their dictator. They did it. We didn't invade like in Iraq. They did it themselves, but we helped them with air power. And so they went ahead and they have a government that's pretty pro-American, frankly pretty liberal. They did not put in an Islamic fundamentalist dictatorship. It's a weak government, to be sure. There were terrorist attacks in Benghazi. Libya's not out of the woods yet. But Libya, I think, poses a model when we look at the next country falling apart. The most severe falling apart we've seen anywhere in the Arab world. Of course, I'm talking about Syria. More than 100,000 innocent Syrians are now dead. In fact, it's hard to know the numbers exactly because the Syrian government doesn't allow the press to come in and report on it. But the rebels, under overwhelming odds, with tremendous support from the Syrian people, but virtually no weapons, certainly no sophisticated weapons, with the Syrian Air Force bombing them from the air, they're actually taking back their country. And they're doing so with no help from us. I've been arguing for 2 years now that we need to help the people of Syria get their country back, just as we did in Libya. And that if we did, we could have a more democratic Syria that is not just good for the Syrian people, but is pro-Western too. A country that recognizes, in a country like Syria where there are lots of minorities, there are Christians, there are Sunni Muslims, and there are Shia Muslims, there are Druze, there are all kinds of people in Syria, that as long as you had a democratic group that respected individual rights, supported by the United States, it is likely that Syria could transition to a country that is not an Assad-like horrible dictatorship, and not an Islamic fundamentalist dictatorship. We wouldn't have to go from the Shah of Iran to Ayatollah Khomeini. We could actually go to a modern secular democracy, as we've tried to do in Libya, as we've done with our allies in Morocco and Jordan. But the Obama government did not listen to me. I think they and people like Chuck Hagel are wrapped up with this idea that we should never be involved in foreign affairs, which makes no sense because we were just in Libya. And if it's not about oil, what is the difference between Libya and Syria? Syria's a bit harder. I accept that. But now what's happening in Syria? After 2 years of crying out, begging, and I brought people on this show. I brought people from Syria who risked their lives to come on this show to talk about the horrific situation, to talk about the Syrian military walking into a home and gunning everybody down, bombing innocent schools just to kill children, just to make people, I guess, give up on the revolution. And we've done nothing. Obama said a few things. The situation in Syria has to stop. We've done nothing. I feel a little bit of humanitarian aid, perhaps. So now what's happening is the Syrian people are turning to whoever can help them, whoever has the arms to fight against the butcher of Damascus, Hafez Assad and his son, Bashir Assad, the current dictator of Syria. The Assad family, Hafez is dead. They've been turning to whomever they can to fight them. So if it's Al-Qaeda, hey, sometimes you have to turn to the devil to fight the devil. What that means is at the end of the day, when the Assad regime falls, and mark my words, the Assad regime will fall. It's only a matter of time. I predict it will happen in this year, 2013, probably after another 50,000 people are murdered. But I think it's going to happen this year. If not this year, certainly next year. It cannot sustain itself. It will fall. The heroes of the Syrian revolution will not be the United States. And they won't be the West. And they won't even be the Syrian people. The heroes of the Syrian revolution are going to be Al-Qaeda. And you take the most sympathetic people in the world, the Syrian people who are being massacred by their own government. And due to our inaction, they're going to become our enemies. And this is an accident waiting to happen. And one that we can stop now. And if it were me interviewing Chuck Hagel, I would say to Chuck Hagel, do you think the Assad regime is going to last? And listen to what he's going to say. I think he's going to say no. I think everyone knows it can't last. We don't know whether it's going to end next month or next year. But it can't last. And then I would say, when it falls, do you want a government that's pro-American or anti-American? Do you want a government that's pro-democracy or anti-democracy? Do you want a government that says our best elements are the students and middle-class shopkeepers who rose up to protect our villages from a madman? Or do you want a culture that praises Al-Qaeda and Islamic fundamentalist terrorists who are anti-American and praises them for saving them from an even worse dictator? See, all you have to do is look at the arc of history to understand that we should be on the right side of it. Once we see that a dictator is going to fall, we have run out to support the people. But in Egypt, you may recall, President Obama didn't withdraw his support from Hosni Mubarak till about 2 weeks before Hosni Mubarak left office. It was a little late. Syria is already extremely late. But better late than never. We Americans should be on the side of freedom and democracy and human rights all over the globe. And even though we can't invade hardly any of these countries, and we shouldn't invade hardly any of these countries, we can help. We can do no-fly zones that cost very little. The war in Libya cost $1 billion, and that sounds like a lot until you recognize that the war in Iraq cost $1 trillion, or 1,000 times that. The Libyan war lasted a few months. The Iraqi war lasted almost 10 years. The Libya war led to no American loss of life. The Iraqi war, 4,000 Americans dead. The Libyan war, the people were fighting themselves to free themselves from the dictator. In Iraq, the people weren't fighting at all. We just invaded to take over. It's a huge mistake to compare Iraq to Libya, to compare Iraq to Syria. It's a huge mistake to compare Iraq to Iran. Again, no one is advocating invading Iran, certainly not me. But remember, we went to war in Iraq precisely because the Bush administration believed, or at least persuaded Americans to believe, that Iraq had nuclear weapons. And even though they used the code words weapons of mass destruction, which is a silly, silly thing, to combine biological and chemical weapons, which are not good things, with nuclear weapons is a ridiculous mismatch. It's like saying we have to be afraid of pins in our... I can think of a better example. We have to be afraid of, in our food, of chicken bones and arsenic. Yeah, it's not good to choke on a chicken bone, but arsenic's a lot more dangerous. We have to be afraid of someone giving us a pinprick with a pin and someone firebombing our house. Well, you just can't put those two in the same category. And what George Bush did is he said, weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. Well, now hang on here. And I realize George W. Bush ain't the brightest light bulb in the universe. But biological and chemical weapons, as awful as they are, biological weapons, what's the worst that's been used? Anthrax, sarin gas. These aren't good things. What have they killed? A few dozen people? Nothing like the 30,000 Americans killed by ordinary guns that are not biological or chemical. The worst chemical weapons that I can think of is mustard gas, and that's been around since World War I. And killed a lot of people in World War I, but nothing like what conventional weapons have done. So biological and chemical weapons, they ain't good. No weapons are good. But they're nothing like nuclear weapons. And I think with Iraq, what the administration did, the Bush administration, is they conflated them all, weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. We even had a WMDs, as if biological and chemical weapons were anything like nuclear weapons. And they're not. As I said, biological and chemical weapons are less dangerous than airstrikes. Our firebombing of Dresden in World War II killed tens of thousands of people. And firebombs are a lot more dangerous than chemical or biological weapons, and yet they're conventional. Nuclear weapons, completely different. Nuclear weapons, one weapon can take out a city. We saw that with Hiroshima. And the weapons that the Iranians are building right now are far more severe than anything we used against Hiroshima. That really is dangerous. And the irony is America was willing to go to war to stop Iraq from getting nuclear weapons. I don't think we really understood the difference between biological and chemical, because I think it's ridiculous to go to war to stop a chemical or biological weapon. But I don't think it's ridiculous to go to war to stop a nuclear weapon. Frankly, I wish we'd stopped North Korea from getting nuclear weapons. Bill Clinton succeeded, and George Bush just let it happen. But to stop them, you don't have to invade a country. See, there are ways to stop them without the kind of full-scale, expensive, dangerous, risky invasions that we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we occupy a country for 10 years. In fact, Iraq really was starting to get nuclear weapons in 1982. Israel bombed the Osiris nuclear plant, and in a few days, the threat was dissipated, and very few people died. When Syria started to develop nuclear weapons, again, Israel bombed Syria, and thank God they did. Can you imagine nuclear weapons being involved in this horrible civil war right now in Syria? We need, if Iran will not respond, and so far they're not responding to sanctions at all, we need a military option to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And I know many say, Mark, that's not a progressive view, that's not a liberal view. Let me tell you why it is. Let me tell you why it is a liberal view. First of all, I'm not advocating invading Iran. That would be really ridiculous and foolhardy. That would be really stupid. Number two, I'm not talking about biological or chemical weapons, which aren't that dangerous. I'm talking about nuclear, which is extremely dangerous. And third, I'm not talking about a relatively stable government like the Soviet Union or China that have nuclear weapons that we can contain, right? I'm talking about a country that has its own revolution where its leaders may not last very long. It certainly does not have very popular leaders. If we can stop a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, where Iran gets nuclear weapons, and then Saudi Arabia gets nuclear weapons, and then Egypt wants nuclear weapons, and then Libya and Turkey, and suddenly everyone in the region wants nuclear weapons. And then for all we know, the emir of Bahrain gets his nuclear weapons and shoots them off, and then what's going to happen? Right? People saying we shouldn't have war in Iran. Of course we shouldn't have war against Iran. But taking out a country's nuclear capability should not lead to war. And if it does, we have to be ready to fight back. Iran is already promoting terrorism all across the globe. So I just think we have to think this through. it's not that war is always a bad thing. It's that war should be a last resort, and we shouldn't use it unless we need to. And there's all kinds, right? You can do what we're doing with drones. You could argue right now that we're at war in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Somalia, and in Mali. I don't think we are. To me, sending drones out does not constitute war. It constitutes destroying a danger, but it's very different from the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. So we should be able to make distinctions as liberals between an all-out war and all-out invasion and destroying a threat. Again, I don't think we should put our heads in the sand and just allow threats to occur. I don't think that if we do nothing and just ignore the world, that we should let Al-Qaeda flourish and let Iranian terrorism flourish. But we can fight back in cheap ways, in ways without going to war, without sending a bunch of troops in. And to rule those out, I think makes America weaker. So I really need to have this argument. I'll tell you what, I'll do a future show where I'll bring on someone who disagrees with me, and I know many of you do. But think about the reasons you disagree. It shouldn't be Bush screwed up Iraq, therefore we can't ever intervene militarily in the world. And it can't be that military intervention is always wrong. Unless you're a pacifist, I think you recognize that we have fought wars that have had good results. World War II, horrible, horrible destruction. 400,000 or so Americans died. Tens of millions of people all around the world died. But at the end of the day, it was a necessary evil. It was a necessary war. Once you accept the fact that some wars are necessary, ask yourself, how do you define which ones are and which ones aren't? And that, to me, is a question that should have been asked Chuck Hagel. When is a war necessary? It's a basic question. When is a war necessary? And I say it's necessary in self-defense. It's necessary to prevent mass murder. And I also think that taking out a threat is different from all-out war. That we don't always have to go. In fact, we should virtually never do all-out war. That sometimes the best way is, bombing a terrorist training camp rather than occupying all of Afghanistan. Something Joe Biden's been saying for a long time. This is Mark Levine, 202-889-9797. If you want to give some final thoughts on what I've said or anything else, please feel free to call in. 202-889-9797. We'll be right back with the last bit of the Inside Scoop right after this.
You're listening to WEAT Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Now get out there and do something.
It's our last errand today, Jimmy. Just need to pick up some light bulbs.
Whoa, there's so many. Did Grandma tell you which ones to buy?
No, but check out the label on this package. It'll help us find the right bulbs.
Does it really matter?
Well, sure. The new light bulbs use a lot less energy, so we save money on our electric bill by using an energy-saving incandescent, CFL, or LED.
How about this bulb?
Let's see. We need to replace the 60-watt bulbs in our bedside lamps. That one is 800 lumens, so it should do the trick.
I've never heard of lumens.
Lumens tell us how bright the light is. The more lumens, the brighter the bulb.
You know, Grandpa, you're a pretty bright guy.
Yeah, you're pretty smart yourself, Jimmy.
Lumens, the new way to shop for light. Learn more at EnergySavers.gov. That's EnergySavers.gov. A message from the U.S. Department of Energy.
Hi, this is Chris Hedges, and when I'm in Washington, I don't want my news filtered through corporate sponsors. I want to hear the truth, which is why I listen to D.C.'s only independent radio station, We Act Radio, 1480 AM, WPWC, Washington's progressive working community. We Act Radio, do something.
Hello, this is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and I want to tell you about my new favorite discovery, Yosemite National Park. I recently went there with my husband and children, and we walked the trails to see the breathtaking waterfalls, admired the grand meadows, and giant sequoias. But the future of our national parks is uncertain. Many challenges face our parks today, from polluted air and water to development threats outside their borders and inadequate funding to protect our national heritage. That's why the National Parks Conservation Association recently completed a decade-long assessment of the challenges facing our national parks, along with proposed actions that will ensure our children and grandchildren will be able to enjoy the parks as we have. Our national parks have inspired Americans for nearly 100 years. As we approach the centennial of the National Park Service in 2016, please join us in helping to protect our national park legacy. Find out how at www.mpca.org.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine. This is our last segment here. We only got a few minutes more. I want to talk a little bit about the Super Bowl. Now, I don't do much sports on this show, to be sure. That's not what I know a lot about. I'm the guy that knows history and law. I'm not the guy to tell you between the Ravens and the 49ers. I guess I want to talk a little bit about Baltimore and San Francisco. They're both solid blue cities, right? They're very liberal. They're very progressive cities. It's hard as a progressive. I got sympathies for San Francisco and Baltimore. But when you think about those two cities, to me, San Francisco is the city of rich liberals and Baltimore is the city of poor liberals, right? Working class people. When I think of San Francisco, I think of liberal-minded, to be sure, but people with wealth, maybe some gay people that are going around living in a beautiful city by the bay and practicing the latest technology and keeping in touch and definitely supporting environmental things and things like that. When I think of Baltimore, I think of working class people striving to make a living and struggling to succeed, and that's unions, and that to me that's also definitely part of the liberal ideal. So it's hard for me to choose between them. I guess I want them both to win. I wasn't gonna. I was just gonna talk about the Super Bowl, but I got a caller on the line at the very last few minutes. Go ahead, caller. Who's this?
Hi, Mark. It's Michael.
Okay.
From New York City.
Hey, Michael.
You want a Super Bowl input?
Sure. Go ahead. I was talking more about the cultural input than the actual teams, but go right ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I'm hoping for Baltimore Ravens for two reasons. Number one, they were robbed last year of championship status and trying to get into the Super Bowl. If anybody remembered that game, it was a game-winning touchdown pass caught that should have given it to the Ravens. But 3 seconds later, a Patriots knocked the ball out of the catcher's hands in front of the referee, and the referee, instead of ruling it a touchdown, ruled it an incomplete pass. I don't know what was going through this referee's mind, but a lot of people said the Ravens were robbed in the chance of getting into the Super Bowl. Now they have a chance to compensate what they did last year, and this leads to the second reason. One of the players, and I'm sorry, I keep forgetting his name, he is retiring after this, and so I thought it would be kind of sweet for him to retire as a Super Bowl champion. You know what I'm saying? That's
fine. I mean, all of that is very specific for and about the teams, and that's all good. I was talking about the fact that, as a Democrat, as a liberal, it's hard to think of two bluer cities in America than San Francisco and Baltimore. But there's very different images, in my mind at least, of the two cities. Baltimore, when I think of Baltimore, I think of a gritty city. I think of unions. I think of working class people. I think of people working in factories. They're solid Democrats, but they're the lunch pail Democrats. I think of San Francisco. I got to use a stereotype. I think of latte sipping Democrats. I think of wealthy liberals sitting by the bay. Now, I know there are homeless people in San Francisco, to be sure, and I know there are rich liberals in Baltimore, to be sure. But to me, I think of both parts of the coalition, and I think about how dramatic it is that two extremely different cities like San Francisco and Baltimore can agree on policies. And I don't know, to me it's part of the depth of progressive cause that Baltimore and San Francisco can come together and be such strong liberal cities. So I want them both to win, but I don't think that's possible.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. If it were to end in a tie, it's going to overtime.
Well, that's true. That's true. No, I understand that. And it's got to be resolved.
Look at it this way. They are both champions right now in their respective conferences.
Absolutely. No question about it. I don't know about you, but I'm going to watch the Puppy Bowl. The Puppy Bowl is put on by Animal Planet each year. This is the 9th annual Puppy Bowl, and if you haven't seen it, you got to turn it on. You won't miss the Super Bowl. It starts actually right when this show ends, in 9 minutes. You can watch it on 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Animal Planet. I'm not being paid for this endorsement. Go and turn on the Animal Planet, and what they do is they stick a bunch of extremely cute, kind of too cute puppies, and they put them on like a little football field, and whoever gets the chew toy across the finish line, that team scores a touchdown. And it's the most adorable thing you've ever seen. The cats do the halftime show, the kittens, I should say, because they're puppies and kittens. Do not miss Puppy Bowl 9. And if you have someone who doesn't like sports, I don't mean to be sexist here, but maybe a girlfriend or a wife. But listen, lots of women like sports, lots of men don't. If you have someone who doesn't like sports, tune them into the Puppy Bowl, and maybe you can have a nice compromise. If your boyfriend makes you watch the Super Bowl with him, you can make your boyfriend watch the Puppy Bowl with you, and then you can actually share something as a couple. So that's my recommendation. I don't care whether the 49ers or the Ravens win. I say go Puppies. I'm pro puppy.
So funny.
I am pro puppy. It's true though. Check it out.
That is so funny.
Michael, you check it out. We're going to talk about it, all right? Check out the Puppy Bowl. It starts in 8 minutes on the Animal Planet, all right? Hey,
I search for it, and please, people, don't dog out the puppy.
I'm not even going there. Michael, thank you for calling in. That's about my time here. This is Mark Levine. As I said, the Raucous Caucus and the Inside Scoop, I host them both. They are every noon to 3 right here on WEAC Radio, 1480 AM. Tune in next week for another edition of the Inside Scoop. And follow me on Twitter at Mark Levine Talk or on my website at marklevinetalk.com. This is Mark Levine signing off.
You're listening to WEACT Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.